Hello and welcome to Harvest of Harvard for June. It is now halfway through the year. We've gotten through things mostly on time, but I've also read a few books this year that I think I've really had to struggle through. My life is different. My life is busier. I have less time to kind of read those long works and kind of squeezing time out. And this month is kind of weird because I don't really go out of my way to do themes for months. Like I choose a few different books based on topics that I want to continue throughout the year. This month, things just weirdly happen to centralize around provincial novels and novels that are weirdly interested with theology, like very deep in the weeds of Christian theology. So these are all books that I think when I was starting out on this reading journey 3 years ago, I would not have enjoyed them at all. I would not have been able to access them. And I think having read through these kinds of ideas in literature over the years, I've become better at understanding things. So let's just talk about these ones. So there's 4 that are physical and then 3 that are through ebooks of various forms. Less impressive to hold like this, but we will get through it. First one is My Antonia, from that little accent on the A, if that's visible. That shows the way that it's pronounced. This is a novel set in Nebraska by Willa Cather, who is an author that was kind of on my radar, but I never really read anything from her until this work. And I've been missing out, I really have. I think her writing is just really, really incredible. There are some moments where I think some writers are able to flick the switch that just makes everything very beautiful. Not all writers can do this, but Willa Cather is absolutely a writer who can do this. And she is particularly good at describing nature and also an individual's reaction to just how beautiful nature is. So even though this novel really isn't about the natural world, our narrator, who is arriving in this provincial area of Nebraska, just has these transcendent moments where he looks out onto the field and just has this life-changing moment of nature. And it's such a beautiful moment. But this novel is really about Antonia, a Eastern European migrant, a Bohemian migrant to this area. And this community has a number of people from various Eastern European communities that are gathered together because of their difference to the wider United States population at the time. And we have our narrator who is not a racist and good at interacting with these people, or at least kind of fascinated with the way that everyone's life is a little bit different. And so he becomes really entranced with Antonia, this character who is struggling really hard to make it through this life. Her father passes away somewhat early in the novel. And there's this debate early on, this is where the theology gets in, about how best to bury him, because he spent an entire life in America, a country that he didn't really want to be in. And so he had this deep sadness in his life the entire time. The burial rites then are being discussed as how best to reflect this individual who religiously isn't aligned with what people in this community believed in. How do we bury him? What rites do we follow? And ultimately, what happens to his body? Like, is it good or bad luck to put him at a crossroads? What does all that mean? And from there, I think we established this really interesting motif that goes throughout the whole novel, which is what is right and what is wrong and what is good in this mode of migration. And I understand that this theme is probably much better explored decades later with migrants from countries that are far more different than Eastern Europe. So migrants from Asia and Africa and Middle East and various other places in the world. But I think for what it's worth, this novel does really well. I think the narration is really empathetic. The way that the characters describe their interactions are done really well. And I think the actual pull of this, not narrator, but main character, really, Antonia, the way that she's pulled between her family and the people who support her and the wider migrant community and their attitude towards just kind of holding parties and celebrating their culture in a way that's quite distant from their wider society, and then the obligations that one has towards having a job and raising a family and all of those things. I think it's really well done, and despite the book's short length, I think it covers the life really well. One of the better books I've read of this style. I would give it a 5 out of 5, and I'm very surprised that the average rating is lower, but I imagine this is one of those books that American high school students have to study and doesn't really get read outside of that context. But you're missing out if you're not. This is a pretty good book. I really enjoy the way it's written, and it makes me look forward to reading more of Willa Cather's works. I do have some more of her books on my shelf as well. Oh, that was my yearly challenge, by the way. This was written in 19. It'll be on the screen. But I've never read a book from this year before. Next one, Breathing Lessons, is my because I wanted to. So I've wanted to read an anti novel for so long. I think everything I hear about her style and what her writing does to people just feels right up my alley. So she's a very naturalistic writer, writes about normal human beings in an ordinary day. This novel is about Maggie Moran, who is married to Ira, and it's about really one day in her life. So she starts off wanting to go to the funeral of her high school friend's late partner. And from there, she ends up revealing a lot of information about her relationship with her husband Ira, her identity growing up again in this regional town, looking at how growing up and making these choices about the person she decided to marry and how she decided to raise her son. Her son Jesse was in a rock band and had a failed marriage with this woman who was a fan of the band, had a child who he didn't raise very well. Like, I don't want to give too much away, but there's also not really a lot of plot elements here. It's so much more about these characters and about these people who, in their own very little way, are very, very annoying. And I think their flaws are so apparent, and yet, well, not just that they're apparent, but they're very entrenched. To the sense that we don't ever seem to see these characters change in any way. The mistakes that they've made throughout their whole life will continue to be made, and that is kind of the core conceit of the novel. And yet, can you continue to love these characters when they are so frustrating, when they have these qualities that will lead them down the same mistakes over and over again? Like, I would say that this novel really is about 3 or 4 main events, and each event for Maggie Moran is exactly the same problem. Her problem is that she's really optimistic, and she believes in changing people, sometimes to the detriment of the people she's trying to change. This happens exactly the same way, over and over and over again, to the point where you think, like, is there any point? And I find it really fascinating to read reviews about this novel where people just don't like it, because they find the main character annoying, and she is really annoying. And yet, the way that it's written is just so heartening and empathetic, and you really feel that desire to change people so strongly. And I mean, the other characters are written really well as well. It's just well done, and I really respect this craft, not only to write a novel that seems so everyday, but you dig under the surface and you realize just how much work went into making this, how much an ordinary life can be represented in such a difficult way, how all these little moments and sentences and moments of dialogue and motifs and characteristics and traits, all of these are so carefully chosen and yet still feel like real people doing real things. I think I just respect it so much. As someone who is working on a work of fiction that would ideally want to use some of these techniques, it just feels masterful. It just feels like an incredibly well-written work. I would give it a 5 out of 5, and acknowledging all the things that would be a very valid complaint against it, it is about very annoying characters, and it is kind of cloyingly sentimental. Like, it's very American in that sense. It has this big heart for people. It believes in the redemptive power of love and family and connections, and it believes that people can't change, and yet that's fine, and we can love them anyway. I think that's a really, really sappy conclusion to arrive at, because I think it's a conclusion that very many people will find unsatisfying, and really it's kind of like the core problem of the narrator even. And yet I just believe in it so much, and this novel makes you believe in it. It makes you see these characters and enjoy your time with them, even though they are so, so frustrating. And yeah, it's a good book. I would want to keep talking about it. I would want to discuss it with friends, elaborate more on it, read everything else that she's written. It's just an amazing time. Really great. Book number 3, this is my, because I didn't want to read it, and this one for obvious reasons, Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, is a novel which is about a grown man having a relationship with a 12-year-old girl, and that's kind of the main conceptual thing. So I don't have a physical copy of it, of course, because I don't really want one in my house, and I didn't want to hold one on the train or anything like that. Like, I think the implications behind this book are there. And I also find it really interesting, the kind of wider discussion about this book, because this is a book that people have heard about and talk about. It's a book where I've heard people described as the moment-to-moment writing is so beautiful that often you forget about the very perverse relationship that you're reading about. And yeah, to an extent I agree. I do think the writing is done really beautifully. The representation of the main character is interesting, and I think really what I appreciate about it is just how much of a game it plays with the reader and with critics and with people trying to analyze it, because we have this narrator who knows he's a bad person and knows he's doing bad things, and also knows how to be manipulative. I find it very interesting because he refers to himself as a very attractive man, and he is, because you see moments where he uses physical attractiveness in order to evade suspicion and to get what he wants. He enters in this relationship with this young girl he calls Lolita, or the novel calls Dolores, or various other names, and he eventually kind of becomes her surrogate father figure because her mother passes away. And so he drives her around America on this tour, hiding the relationship and kind of showing her the world, and getting really frustrated at her because whilst he knows psychologically he is sexually attracted to her, and that's why he's done all of this, emotionally she doesn't provide for him. And of course she doesn't. She's 12, right? And this is kind of the anger and dissatisfaction at the core of this novel, is that our narrator, his name is Humbert, he's very dissatisfied, and he's very manipulative, and he's trying to get what he wants, and he can't do that. And all the meantime, the reader is stuck in this weird phase of going, I'm still reading this novel about this horrible person, and he's also a very unreliable narrator. We don't know or trust or like him or any of that. So why am I still engaged to keep reading this? What do I have to gain from doing this? And I also find it really fascinating that, yes, there are a lot of people that seem to forgive our narrator because his writing style is fairly charming and he expresses himself well, and they don't acknowledge the actual crimes that he himself confesses to have committed. It's just a weird time. And I think with that knowledge, with the knowledge of how much controversy this book created and how much discussion it created as well, how various people have come to interpret it over time, and how it's come to represent all these different things, and yet at its core we have Humbert, a man who is so pathetic and so unable to find happiness for all of these various reasons. I just think it's bizarre. I think it's complex. I don't have many words for it aside from that. And I think if I was at university and I was required to study this and someone said sit down and write an essay about this, I would probably have taken more time to formulate my own views of it and what I interpret about it. Only having read it as a book, kind of just a tick of a box really, because this is a book that's talked about so much, I find it interesting, and I think I've blanked out the possibility of extracting anything more from it other than that. I think that Humbert is a bad person. I think the book is written well. I think there is weirdly this kind of enjoyment to be had because you want to see the consequences happen for him and you're not really sure how it's going to come about. Yeah, it's okay. It's a fine book, very skillfully written, and I think there is a lot more to discuss and a lot deeper to dig for somebody who's not me, really. I would give it a 4 out of 5. This is a weird thing to say. I would give it a 4 out of 5 for kind of how interesting it is as a piece of writing and also as a cultural, like a cultural footnote. I think the amount of discussion this book has created is fascinating. And I feel kind of bad for Nabokov that this is the book that he's known for forever, whereas he is a very experimental writer. He's done a lot of other things, and yet this is the thing that's synonymous with him. But I think it's well done, and I think it's interesting. I think that, of course, you would need to know what you're getting into before you start reading it, and of course this is also the first and only thing people know about this novel, so it is what it is. I found it really hard to talk about. And book number 4, this is my Shakespeare month. Henry VIII is a play that we don't talk about, and I find that really fascinating because it's pretty good. So I would imagine one of the reasons why we don't talk about this is because it's not entirely written by Shakespeare. I think scholarship suggests that half of it was written by Shakespeare and half was by John Fletcher. This is one of the later plays in Shakespeare's career, and it's one of the history plays that doesn't really fall into the main series. So Henry VIII takes place after Richard III, just in the historical timeline. Richard III, usurper of the throne, dies at the end of his play, and then Henry VII takes the throne. Henry VII, I'm actually not entirely sure what happens to him, but of course he doesn't survive, so Henry VIII takes the throne. Henry VIII is a very loaded historical figure. I think the amount of information and assumptions that people have about him as a king, compared to pretty much all the other rulers of England, is high. I think people will kind of know and have assumptions about who he is because of the main things that he did, which was divorce his wife, marry Anne Boleyn, have a daughter, have this obsession for having a male heir, and breaking away from the Catholic Church in order to do so, and also eating a lot of food, is the assumption that we have nowadays. He's an interesting figure, and given that this is the second text I've read about him, so the first would be Wolf Hall, I find what's really interesting about Shakespeare's rendition of Henry VIII is that some of the history plays are kind of morally boring because they're very one-note. They have characters who are good and characters who are bad, and an ending that is very clear to say this is a good thing and that is a bad thing. Richard III, for me, suffered the most from this. I think Richard III as a play just has, this character is extremely evil, and that character is nothing but good. And these characters in between are just kind of oscillating back and forth between who they're loyal with. And to me, that's just not very interesting, right? Whereas Henry VIII is about a period of time in English history where good people are being punished for their goodness and bad people are being rewarded for their badness. And because loyalty is fraught, are you going to be loyal to the king or loyal to the church, given that these two things right now aren't connected? It makes for this setting that's a lot more morally complex than a lot of the previous Shakespeare plays, because what does good mean in this case? What does loyalty mean? Who are you loyal to? And can you be loyal to two things that are opposed and yet demand your loyalty at the same time? And so we have characters that between acts either catapult themselves into power or fall massively from grace. And in each of these circumstances, there are just some really, really good speeches. Like, I used to teach a module at a tutoring course called Shakespearean Speeches. And that was all about breaking down one moment of a Shakespeare play, that's just one character giving a speech, and analyzing that for all it's worth. It's looking at all the different techniques that are used, enjoying it as a piece of literature, and I would have included some speeches from this play had I read it, had I known they exist. Because some of the speeches I've read in this play are by far the best I've read in Shakespeare. Better than all the main plays, better than Othello, better than Macbeth. I think that there are just tremendously complex and well-written, beautiful speeches in here about this nature of power and humanity and your value and who you're loyal to. I just think it's so, so well done. And I really enjoyed reading the speeches. The actual kind of moment-to-moment play and conflict, I think, is not quite as strong. And it doesn't have a very clear character arc, because I guess it's more interested in showing the actions of Henry VIII than it is making him a character. And I think also because immediately after Henry VIII is Elizabeth I, and then immediately after her is James, who is the king at the time this play was being produced. So it's a very recent history, and I get the sense that they didn't want to kind of moralize it as much as the earlier texts. So I get why it's not so popular, although I wish it was more popular. I think it is well written and quite enjoyable. I think it's weirdly underrated, like wildly underrated for a Shakespeare play. I would give it a 4 out of 5. I think I enjoyed it so much more than I thought I was going to, and it stands out among the history plays as one that is more complex than what I was expecting going in, so I really liked it. The next one, The Crocodile Fury. This is an interesting book. This is probably going to be quite hard to find now. So it was published in 1992. It is by a Malaysian-Australian author named Beth Yahp, and she was my teacher for my creative writing course at uni, and I really enjoyed that course and I learned so much about it. And I really wish that I'd read this before doing the course, because I have a lot of opinions about this, and I really, really want to have a chat with people who have read it, with the author, with critics. I just think it's such a fascinating book, because you set aside the standard hero's journey narrative for this book. This book is about 3 generations of a family in a Southeast Asian country in a kind of a convent school setting, where over 3 generations this building becomes different things. So for the grandmother, this building is the house of a rich man, and so he takes care of servants and he manages this whole estate. And then later on, the rich man suffers this fall from grace effectively, and it goes into disrepute. It then becomes a convent school, and for 2 generations we have the characters who attend the school and variously suffer from the hauntings that exist because of the rich man's actions and also the nature of this school is being built very close to the jungle being kind of this spiritual and lawless place. We have these recurring motifs of jungle animals, so things like lizards and fish and crocodiles, and these things that are so powerful that go beyond human comprehension and enact their forces on these characters who are in no place to really understand what's going on. And so we have the grandmother who believes in all these folklore superstitions. We have the mother who is this midway point, and there's this repeated phrase throughout the text, before my mother became a Christian, because there's a sense that after that moment of becoming a Christian, she changes as a person, and she flicks from a Eastern mythologized view of the world to a more westernized, binary good and evil view of the world. And in doing so, we're interested in the kinds of behaviors that have carried over after she's become a Christian. We're interested in how her upbringing in this convent influences the kind of person that she is and influences the daughter that she would eventually bring up. And then we have the narrator, the daughter, who is trying to piece together the story, constantly asking her grandmother, tell the story of the ghost house, tell us all of these secrets from the past. And she is friends with a character who's only named the bully, and someone who is very ostracized from this convent school and has their own real narrative arc of their own. I just think it's quite interesting because it's so nonlinear. And from the very first chapter, or from the first few chapters, you start to notice patterns, you start to notice phrases that get repeated over and over again. And as you read, you learn more significance about these phrases. You piece together the story of the three generations and the three periods of which this convent and rich man's house existed. And you start to understand more, but you're also very aware that you won't see the whole picture. And there are a lot of things that may or may not be symbolic and may or may not have actually happened. Things that might be spirits or dreams or uncertainties, and we just don't know the real answer. After I finished reading the novel, I just wanted to read the whole thing again, and actually try to see if my knowledge of the whole text would give me more insight into what some of the early chapters meant. And I just think that's so pleasurable. I think it's such a big risk for a novel to do that, especially a debut novel. And to go against what we expect from a to B narrative, because I think most people read a book once, right? Most people will just want to understand the entirety of the book from the whole way through. And this being a book that resists that and instead uses a very Eastern kind of structure in order to get that through, I admire, and I think that's really interesting. I think the way that it represents haunting is very interesting as well, and I definitely want to learn some things from that as I work on my own haunting book. The way that the supernatural doesn't necessarily have to behave by rules. I think our assumption with high fantasy and supernatural is that there are certain rules that exist because we need to know these rules in order to have stakes. Whereas in a text like this, because of the nonlinear structure, we don't think of stakes in the same way. And because of the uncertainty and the kind of animism within these spirits and demons and ghosts and beliefs, we're okay with not knowing. Like, we want to know more, but we also are aware that we won't know everything. And so I think it's quite an insightful book. It's a very humbling book to read. It's challenging and rewarding. I would give it a 4 out of 5. It's difficult, and I think that reading it for fun, well, you need a particular attitude towards fun in order to derive something out of that. It will be very demanding to read, and the first few chapters really did make me bounce off. I really didn't have to struggle through it. But I think I'm very glad that I've read this, and hopefully there's copies of it around. It's an old book. I don't really know how I found this even. I think I got it from a thrift store. But I wish people knew more about it. I wish actually people would talk about this as Australian fiction, because it's great, and it does something so different than copy off existing structures that we come to expect of Australian fiction. So I think it's done really well. Highly recommended. My light reading this month is Prince Caspian by C.S. Lewis from the Chronicles of Narnia. I've never read any further than The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in the series, and I think reading the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as a kid, I really enjoyed it. I really liked these characters, and I really liked this redemptive narrative. I think as a kid I probably would have appreciated how simple it was as well. I would say The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe resides in this really nice space between like Lewis Carroll nothing really matters type fantasy and J.R.R. Tolkien massive rules high fantasy. Narnia is kind of this middle ground where we do have this world, we do have laws and beliefs and societies and all of this thing, and yet because we're going to that world through a portal, because we are following kids and not adults, because the stakes are still a little bit lower and we're discovering things, and because of Aslan, who his gifts to the various characters and his way of solving problems goes against these feelings of stakes, it's still quite enjoyable. And it's still a book where I think as a child I really appreciated The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I never read any further past that. But Prince Caspian is okay. I was really underwhelmed. So I think reading it as an adult, this is going to sound so mean, I don't like any of the characters. I think as a kid, I didn't like Edmund, I didn't like Lucy, I did like Peter and Susan, but only because maybe I was a kid. I was a bit of like an appeal to authority kind of person. Like I liked people who followed the rules, and Peter and Susan seemed like they were doing the right thing for the most part. This book, reading it as an adult, makes me aware of actually how frustrating I find both Peter and Susan, in that Susan is pragmatic to a fault, even when we're in this fantasy world. She seems like this barrier that characters need to have to convince her of in order to get her on board with things. And Peter comes off as very self-righteous and wanting to take leadership over this group as the oldest, and he's not always right either. Whereas Edmund, having learned from his mistakes in the first book, does step up a little bit in this book, and Lucy, being childish wonder, is always going to be Lucy. So what really annoys me is that, well, premise-wise, these characters are going off to school. It's been a year since the events of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Suddenly, there's this weird universe shift, and they all flip back into Narnia. As it turns out, minor spoilers inside of the book, someone blew Susan's horn of summoning in a time of great need, and that's pulled the four heirs of Narnia back into the kingdom because something's gone wrong. And in Narnia, it's more than 1,000 years into the future, where the old kingdom that Peter, Edmund, Lucy, and Susan ruled had fallen into ruin, and we have these other people, the Telemariners or Telmarines, that have come in from another place, and they've come basically as colonists. They've invaded the area, they've set up things, and they've erased the history of old Narnia. They've erased the idea that there's talking animals and magic and all of that. They've set up this human kingdom. And to me, this seems very prescient about English colonialism, but setting all of that aside, it's about it's a resistance story where Prince Caspian, who is one of the heirs of the Telmarine Empire, he is told all these stories by his nurse about the old kingdoms, and he starts to delight in that, and he has a lot of empathy for them. And so he decides to rebel from his kingdom and lead the hiding talking animals and other residents of Narnia in this war against the invaders. It sounds like a premise for a really big high fantasy story, and because this novel's quite short, it's 50,000 words, that war is a bit protracted in a sense. Like, it doesn't feel like it has the same weight that I would have expected. And yet, ultimately, with all of these balls being juggled in the air, I was just frustrated at how little the four kids seem to change, because in the first novel, they all have their own individual character arcs. They all kind of grow, they develop characteristics, they develop virtues, and they overcome things that, as children, they had trouble with, because there's a sense that by the end of the first novel, they're all going out hunting in Narnia, they've ruled the kingdom for decades, like they've become adults. And so to see them go through the same problems as the previous book in this one is a bit frustrating. I don't find that much in this book to be that different from the first one. I thought that the plot beats and structures were really similar, to the point where I thought, I don't know if I really need to read this. It just seems like more of the first, to its fault. Like it retreads steps of the first, when I think I really wanted this to be something more, something different. So I would give this a 3 out of 5, and I will continue reading the series. I do like how light it is. I do enjoy this style of fantasy where I don't need to pay attention to every little bit of detail. I'm just enjoying the quest. I think it's done well. There's moments that feel good. Yeah, it's fine. It's okay. It's a 3 out of 5. And lastly, Oscar and Lucinda by Peter Carey. Now, this is my Booker Prize winner of the month. This is the third text by Peter Carey I've read. Peter Carey, one of the most famous Australian literary authors, winner of the Booker Prize twice, once for Ned Kelly, True History of the Kelly Gang, and once for this, Oscar and Lucinda. Kind of a... I don't like him. What can I say? I don't really like him. And the things I don't like about this book and also True History of the Kelly Gang are very apparent. And I'll just start by saying this. The premise of this book is good. The premise of True History of the Kelly Gang is not really a novel that I wanted to read, because Ned Kelly, Australian bushranger, icon, hero, whichever, is already a person that has cultural conscience. Oscar and Lucinda is a historical novel set in regional Australia and later Sydney, and premise-wise, it's really interesting. It's about two gambling addicts. So Oscar, who's the son of a preacher, and Lucinda, who is the heir to this glassworks plant. And both of them are variously agents in their society, like they have power and they have standing, and they have expectations placed on them, and they're both variously addicted to gambling. Lucinda bets Oscar that he can't ship a church made of glass down I believe the Murray or the Darling, like a river, to a inland town named Boat Harbour and set it up. And so this is a novel about a son of a reverend, addicted to gambling and terrified of water, terrified of boats, shipping this hugely impractical structure with really big stakes, like a whole life's fortune worth of stakes. This sounds like it should be interesting, it should be fun, and this is shedding light on characters in a historical period that I didn't actually know as much about as True History of the Kelly Gang. I thought I would enjoy it more. The issue I have with it is that it's just very long, and when we describe a novel as Dickensian, so people go out of the way to talk about how Dickensian this novel is, it is just very detail-oriented to a fault. Maybe this is... Okay, I know this is just me. I know this is my preferences and the style of books that I do enjoy and that I don't enjoy. I don't enjoy these long-winded descriptions of characters from their birth. And I don't enjoy needing to know every little detail of a person before I can then see them do interesting things. Like, this is a book called Oscar and Lucinda. It's a book about the relationship between these two characters. And they don't meet until halfway through the book, because we need to hear their backstories in entirety before we get any sense of narrative movement. I struggled through it. It was a real slog. I think even as the writing is really beautiful, and even as there are these kind of incidentally really beautiful moments, I think it's very quotable. There are parts of it that I really enjoy. And as I'm saying these things, I've realized I've said the exact same thing about David Copperfield, is that there are scenes in that book that I love, but the entirety of that book is not that good. I think it's a book where you kind of need to work through the slow parts to get to the good parts, and my preference in reading is just a book that's mostly good parts. And yes, I guess that it's very dismissive of what this book is trying to do, but it's just not enjoyable. It's just so factual about specifics of theology at the time and what this church means to different religious groups, about what Oscar's beliefs are as a reverend who gambles, and about glassworks and what it's like to manage a business as a woman in this society. And it's a lot of facts and details and things that... It's just a lot. Just a lot. And I think as someone who was reading many of the early chapters thinking, where is this going to go? When are we going to get to the actual plot? It's a bit frustrating. And I think the romance subplot in this book as well is one of those literary romances where they're not going to just satisfy the standard romance arc for the readers. To me, it feels like a way of making romance palatable for a wider literary audience. Like, men wouldn't be embarrassed to read this novel about a romance because it's not really a romance kind of thing. I almost kind of wanted the romance to be clearer, because that would have given a stronger narrative drive to what we have here. But, you know, I can't complain what the novel isn't. I can only say what it is, and it's fine. I understand people who like it. I guess if you're the kind of reader that wants something to last for a long time and have these characters that are rich, consistent, and be rewarded for your patience, this is a novel that does do that, but it does demand a lot of patience, and it does have a lot of things that just made me keep wondering, like, why is this in here? Does it really need to be in here? I don't think it needs to be in here. There are some anecdotes I just had to flick back through after I finished. Some anecdotes from the earlier parts of the text. I thought, that never came back up, right? And that wasn't that significant to the character ultimately. It's just kind of like, it feels long. It's 500 pages, and I would say maybe about 60 to 80% is holistically relevant, and the rest are kind of just like set dressing and details and things that I don't really know. So I will give it a 3 out of 5. Peter Carey, I finished the 2 works that have won the Booker Prize. This won both the Miles Franklin and the Booker Prize. Like, it's a loved novel, and I wonder if I'm in the minority for disliking it as much as I did. But yeah, no, it didn't really do it for me. Okay, and that's my books of July. Thank you for joining again. These books got me feeling pretty tired. So next month, I'm probably going to try and read things that are a bit lighter. I still feel really ambitious. Like, I still feel a lot about all the different things that I can do this year. I have not started the projects that I really care about. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks, I do have some leave. I do want to try and read things that are more challenging and talk about the reading and writing life at large. We'll see how that goes. Okay, thank you for joining. I'll see you next time.